At the Kenya National Union of Teachers after Secretary General Wilson Sossion sent National Chair Mudzonzili packing. Caroline B now joins us with the details.
The solidarity of the Kenya National Union of Teachers is under test if the current managerial division is anything to go by. National Chairman Mudzonzili has just addressed the media over his forceful retirement, and this is what he had to say.
Iwapo kesho Hesbon Otieno ataandika barua, hiyo mimi nitaheshimu. Iwapo National Executive Council itatoa maamuzi yake, mimi hiyo nitaheshimu. Lakini si Sossion.
Secretary General Wilson Sossion has instead appointed Wycliffe Omuche as the acting national chairman, effect from Thursday next week.
Any union official shall cease, it's not an option, shall cease to hold office upon attaining the age of 60.
Sossion has defended the move, saying the NAT constitution allows him to kick the officials 6 months to their retirement.
We've got organized transition of leadership in the union, and all that is casted in the constitution of the Kenya National Union of Teachers. And I would like to allay the fears that there is a split in the union. There is no split. In fact, there is a lot of constitutional order.
The position that I'm going to act in before the delegates endorse me in December, it's a very enormous position, a position that has great challenges.
And to fill the vacant positions, NAT will be holding the National Delegates Conference in December, which Omuche has already presented his candidature for the position. Caroline B, KTN News.
All right, so the conversation in the country over the last week or so, in fact, over the last couple of months, has been the state of our economy, and that common phrase that we're all hearing now about the prolonged electioneering period, that's what we're calling it. But more specifically, last week, Kenyans were a little worried by a statement that came out of Treasury regarding seeking another bond. In other words, getting the country into more debt. That is the focus of our discussion on the show tonight. I will reintroduce you to my guests in just a moment. But please listen to the conversation I had with the Cabinet Secretary for Treasury, Mr. Henry Rotich, and asked him specifically about floating another Eurobond. Listen.
What we're doing with this one that you're talking about, the Eurobond that you want to float, because we do know of that debt that was maturing in October, and then that's been moved to March 2018?
I think what was reported in the papers is wrong.
What is the correct position?
I think the person who was reporting was struggling to understand what I meant. What I meant is
what do you mean?
We are dealt with the issue of the syndicated loan. I don't know where he's bringing about. Those are things that we finished in October. What we are saying is going forward. What the question was posed to me is that are we still likely to float a Eurobond going forward? I said yes. We are in, when we entered the market the first time in 2004, we were there to stay, to participate and always take advantage of the international capital markets to raise funds for infrastructure development and what other countries do for liquidity management.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that in the general state of our economy. My guest tonight, Anzetse Were, who's a development economist, Phyllis Wakiaga from the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, and Dr. Alex Awiti, who's director of the East African Institute at the Aga Khan University. We will get to the state of our economy, but just your quick reaction, Anzetse, I'll start with you, on us going for more debt.
I think the reason why I'm concerned is that when they floated the first Eurobond, the whole argument was that they were going to leave the domestic market to allow private sector in the domestic space to take up the domestic space. But what we saw is that as that accrual of debt happened, they were going quite aggressively into the domestic market to borrow. And then on top of that, we have this interest rate cap, which means banks prefer to lend to government now. Right. So we're in a situation where the domestic sector, the private sector, is being squeezed out of credit in the domestic space, and yet we're still going into very aggressive lending internationally. So it begs the question as to which strategy are we prioritizing and what are the real consequences, because we seem to be doing a lot of both.
Okay. Phyllis?
One of the things we've been talking about a lot is crowding out the private sector from borrowing locally, and we've encouraged borrowing internationally. However, why are we borrowing? And how accountable are we for the money that we're borrowing? Because that's another question. We definitely borrowed a lot for infrastructural projects. But what is the return on investment on some of those projects? Are we realizing it quickly enough? And how quickly are we also growing our own domestic sectors? Manufacturing and export, for example. Are those growing fast enough to be able to repay this debt? The investments we've made, are they paying back into the economy? Take the railway, for example. We are probably paying back the debt for the railway. Have we started transporting cargo? What money are we making out of it? So even if we are borrowing, are we able to repay? And from the clip that we've looked at, it appears that there is a challenge in regards to repaying our debts. And once we have on the international front a challenge in repaying debt, it also does have an effect on borrowing by the private sector because the credit rating of the country goes down, and that has an impact also on the private sector. So it's an area we have to look at seriously and determine, are we borrowing internationally? Are we doing it locally? Can we then allow the local companies and businesses to borrow locally so that they're able to expand? So it's a broader fiscal conversation that we must have as a country.
Okay, so let's start that conversation then. Alex, from where you sit, what's the state of our economy? We keep saying the prolonged electioneering period. It's becoming a buzzword or a buzz phrase, if you like. What's your assessment of where we are now?
Well, I think the elections and everything around it is a very convenient excuse. But I think what is really critical, and where I think Mr. Rotich and his colleagues are failing fundamentally, is to provide a coherent policy direction that balances their fiscal and monetary policy. I think what we're seeing is a very fragile debt pyramid. Debt stability is becoming a big problem. And I think it's the real balance in terms of what is the policy space for managing government spending. And how do you manage government spending while at the same time making sure that your tax levels are not prohibitive to private saving, but also to corporations going forward. But again, as my colleagues have said, where is the space for managing interest rates? And what are some of the regulatory and some discretionary policy spaces that you can use to then do that? I think this is where Mr. Rotich is stuck. And I think part of the problem going forward is that, we understand that debt is really the lifeblood of capital, of capitalism. But I think the big question really is, how do you tame public spending without at the same time? Because if you look at, say, the aggregate demand that has been generated, we have on one side, you have consumption, you have investment, you have government spending, and then you have export earnings. But I think the real problem is really to disaggregate government spending from the aggregate GDP growth over the last several years. There's a lot of government spending that has been injected in the economy, and now this economy is so used to public spending that if you start to remove that, as he says, that he's not going to spend more money on infrastructure, this thing will halt. Now, so the question really is, what is the right amount of debt that then drives a multiplier effect in terms of investment in some of the most critical elements of growth? At the same time, not crowding out opportunities for real growth in the economy, because this is like dope. What we've been doing, injecting too much of public spending into the economy, and then we're now so used to it. The multiplier effect is there, but I think Rotich has to really carefully manage that stability.
Okay, interesting analogy. And let's say everybody says we've been battered by the elections. Do you believe that we are where we are solely because of the elections, or at least
that's an oversimplification, clearly. I mean, if you look at sort of at the end of last year coming into this year, we had the interest rate cap that hit the financial sector. That's about 10% of GDP. Then we had a drought that hit agriculture, which is about 30% of GDP. So even without elections, about 40% of GDP was struggling. Now, we're seeing some recovery in the agricultural sector, but the financial sector is still struggling. So I think, one, it's an oversimplification. I think the other thing is that we do have an appreciation of the fact that the economy does tend to slow down a bit during an election year. Activity is slower than it would have been, but it is not the only contributing factor. So if you look at sort of the past 10 elections that we've had, about 7 have been associated with slower growth by about 1 to 1.5%. 1.4%, and that's what we're seeing this year, that our GDP forecasts have been cut down.
Yeah.
But sort of linking to what Alex and Phyllis is saying, one of the fundamental problems we're having with government expenditure is, number one, that appetite for spending is not being curtailed.
Yeah.
We keep on being told in terms of the fiscal space that there'll be austerity measures, they're going to cut non-discretionary spending, and they're going to do all these things, but we see that ballooning expenditure, and we see the continued sort of imbalance between development expenditure, which is what we're talking about. We need more development-oriented expenditure that is economically productive, but we always see the usual pattern of recurrence taking the bulk of the money and then development taking less of it. And even within the development docket, we only absorb about 60% of what is in the development docket.
And the rest?
Whereas, so that's one of the things around
and where
fiscal
does the rest
space.
of that go?
Precisely. That's one of the, when you look at the way budget statements are tabled and the way fiscal policy is articulated, tracking that development spending going forward, it can be quite difficult. Often in supplementary budgets, what happens is that some money is taken out of the development docket to meet the recurrent, which is sort of what we saw when this extra election came in. We are quite frankly eating into development for recurrent expenditure. Now, the reason why that's a problem is because we get into debt for development. You cannot get into debt for recurrent. You cannot get into debt to pay salaries and those simple things. You have to get into debt in an activity that will be economically productive, and as they're saying, we will make our money back and we'll be able to pay back that debt. So one of the concerns I'm having around the fiscal space is a divide between recurrent and development. What happens to the development funding that is not used? Does that end up get absorbed in recurrent? And sort of the other macroeconomic issues that dampen the way the economy is growing, such as a manufacturing sector that has really not gotten enough attention for a long time, an agricultural sector where we have a lot of labor locked. We have about 80% of rural labor is locked in a sector that only contributes 30% to GDP. So I think beyond politics and these other things, there are certain structural issues that have to be addressed. And I think something else is the revenue generation issue, which government seems to be not very clear on how they're going to solve that. And I think we need to get into that.
All right, we'll get into that. Before you comment, I'd like us to listen to the Cabinet Secretary Rotich. I asked him this very question, whether it is a cop-out to say we are where we are because of the elections that we have had in this country. Let's listen.
Cop-out, blaming our current economic situation on the election, that there are some serious structural problems with our economy. Neglect of the informal sector, for one, the agricultural sector, manufacturing as well, which, as you know, is labor intensive and will be able to mop up all this unemployment.
For manufacturing to take off, you needed all what I've just mentioned. You needed good roads, you needed faster transportation, you needed lower cost of power and the like. These ones were not there by 2012. The cost of power was about 18 cents per kilowatt.
Phyllis is speaking directly to
the manufacturing sector. Just to pick up from where Nzetse left, it's a fact that elections do slow down GDP growth, and we've seen the same this year. If you looked at the Bureau of Statistics Q2 numbers for manufacturing specifically, the sector grew by 2.3%. compared to 5.3% last year. So definitely we are seeing an impact. But it's definitely not just the elections. There's what has been mentioned, the drought, the issues of inflation that hit the economy. For the manufacturing sector, also a lot of unpredictability in terms of the regulatory space. You saw what happened with the plastic bags and the stalemate we had for quite some time. And it touched on industrial plastic. And because of that, we did see a slowdown. There were issues of counties, where we have the counties coming up with the different taxes, and we've spoken about that numerously. Delayed payments by county governments, and then the retail sector had the challenges that it had that also affected the manufacturing sector. So if you look at the issues affecting the manufacturing sector, it's really a myriad of issues. We've tried to do what we can in terms of building the infrastructure, trying to come up with lower cost of energy, but the reality is it moved from 18 to probably about 15. And with the drought we had this year, the FCC went up again. So we are moving one step forward and also taking another step backwards.
So your reaction then to the Cabinet Secretary, because he's just talked about a lot of investment in terms of, shoring up the manufacturing sector, electricity, rail, and that sort of thing. Do you agree that those priorities are, one, in the right place, and whether they have been sufficient to boost manufacturing in this country?
I agree that the sector needs investment in those areas to be able to grow. We have to look at the cost of what that investment cost in the first place and the return on that investment.
Yeah.
Then look at the other issues, the softer issues around the regulatory space, for example. How do we develop our policies? How predictable are we? I was looking at a World Bank report released on investment competitiveness, and they said about 30% of companies actually leave developing countries because of the regulatory space. The fact that they come and invest and settle in, but once they're in, you see new regulations coming up that you hadn't planned for.
But isn't that then what is usually captured in the ease of doing business report that's by the World Bank that talks about, you know, the number of laws that are in place, regulations, how easy or difficult it is to start and you know, propagate a business. And we've improved this year, haven't we?
The ease of doing business is a very important report, and really the country has improved. We were number 80 out of, I think
we've
last year we were number
18 points?
12. Yes, we've done a really good job on ease of doing business.
Right.
The ease of doing business is an important indicator, especially as you start up your business and get into an economy. How long it takes you to set up your company, to get construction permits, to get electricity approved. We are really doing a good job on that. Some key indicators like the export competitiveness part of the ease of doing business, that's one indicator we are not doing very well in still, that needs improvement. But competitiveness is about how competitive I am as I'm doing the business. I've come and set in, it's easy for me to come in, but how easy it is it for me to continue sustaining my business?
I see.
So that's when you look at things like the competitiveness index report. And that's another important indicator. And that report released by World Bank really spoke a lot about investment competitiveness. Once I invest, how competitive am I in that market?
Right.
So we need to look at the issues beyond getting into the market, which is important, and the fact that we've been able to address some of them is indicative of the possibility to also address those that affect the day-to-day competitiveness of business.
Okay. Alex, let's talk about the political scenario a little bit, because I know you are in a position to comment on just about everything that is happening, the political rhetoric. I mean, there's a call for boycott of certain products and services in the country, and the resultant effect on me, my purchasing power, you know, my savings and the decisions I'm able to make as far as my money is concerned.
I think our politics, just like everywhere else, is inextricably bound with the economy. And I think what really throws everything off kilter is the negative political rhetoric that comes out of the political class, the inability to manage and moderate the conversations in a way that limits the conversation to political competition, but not something that is almost subversive to the economy. I think that's what we've seen from Mr. Dinga and Mr. Kenyatta over the last 3 or 4 months. I think that's not reassuring to investors, and there's quite a significant amount of capital flight already from the stock market. I think there's a lot of wait and see from many companies in terms of capital investments. Consumers are postponing purchase decisions, just waiting to see. All of this in aggregate really slows down the economy. And as Nzesi said, every election cycle from 92 to 97 to 2007 to 2017, there's a little dip in 2013, but wasn't much. That really demonstrates that our politics really affects the environment, the business environment. But really going forward, in terms of the boycott, whatever it is that is going to get out more people out of Safaricom into Airtel is basically going to be just movements of people. But I don't think that it's going to change the structure of the telecom sector in terms of what happens in the sector. It's going to be profits. Maybe Safaricom might dip Airtel, but I think Airtel has a lot of capacity issues. Even if people shift, there's still a lot of complaints. In my own village, for instance, I can't get data on Airtel. So they have to do a lot of stuff. This is going to create a huge challenge for them in terms of new investments to cope with that capacity. I think huge issues around, say, vegetable oils. I think if that boycott goes on with Bidco, I think there's going to be an issue with the producers of these products. Because every time you shift out of one product, there's going to be a substitute. Now, who's going to get the windfall? Is it going to be our neighbors from Uganda? Is it going to be our neighbors from Tanzania? Or from China? But what happens to our manufacturing base? What happens to our farmers? So I think, you know, there's everything that everyone is saying about this boycott, and all of the NASA folks are pretty enthusiastic about it. But I think we ought to be very careful about how far we push some of these things. We really have to understand in a very complex way the fallout effects of these of these decisions by the opposition. I think it's to make a political point, but I think at a certain point we've got to draw the line between politics and economics and fight these battles in very separate arenas. But I think going forward, I think what we really need to speak about is how is the ordinary Mwananchi feeling about these things? What are people feeling lately about the state of the economy? I think the slowdown generally has basically affected everyone. I think everyone all over the place is complaining about not having enough money, sales are not up.
And that's an interesting point, Alex, because you know, sometimes it is a perception, and we may not all be able to articulate it in, you know, economic terms. And I pose this question to the CS, and then we will see it later on, where, I mean, people are generally feeling what they call the effects. So, Anzetse, how would you explain that? How would you break that down for me to say, well, I feel like the economy is depressed. I feel like my 1,000 doesn't take me as far as it used to before. In fact, CS Adan Mohammed tweeted about it. He said they're yet to see any businesses that have closed as a result of the election. And there was this barrage of responses to that tweet saying, well, you don't know how I'm feeling.
That's right.
But just explain to us about this perception. Is it real or is it all in the mind?
No, it's real. And there are a couple of variables going on. I think obviously the first one has been mentioned was the drought, which had a knock-on on inflation, where we were at double digits for a couple of months, and we were well above the inflation ceiling of 7.5%. So already people were seeing that their money isn't going as far as it usually did. The other big thing that affected people was the interest rate cap, where we saw a contraction in liquidity in the markets, where banks just stopped lending. So in a time like this, when your things are slowing down, you usually go to the bank and get your loan of 50,000 or 80,000, but now you're not getting that money at all. So you're feeling the pinch even further. I think something else that people aren't talking about is county government and the role county government is having on killing small and medium enterprise. If you look at fiscal policy at the county level and you look at the capacity of county to pay back small and medium enterprise and a lot of informal businesses, particularly outside of big urban areas, county government is letting down a lot of Kenyans and failing to pay them. So when you save up and give in a big contract to county and then county doesn't pay you for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I think that's something that we need to start thinking about. Kenya is stop obsessing about the national stuff, which is very important, but let's also start holding county governments accountable for their fiscal responsibilities, for their payments. Also, this ease of doing business that the World Bank has released, I think is very useful, but I don't think it has picked up the nuanced ways through which devolution has made business more difficult.
And that's an interesting thing that you mentioned, because I do remember the chair, Dr. Kiprono Kitonyi of the National Chamber of Commerce, decrying this lack of payment, you know, of suppliers at the county level.
It is. Even for manufacturers and SMEs, a lot of people supply to county governments and they are owed money for some over a year, others even more. And that's a big issue, especially for SMEs.
And so what's happening with the county governments, do you think, with their inability? Is it, you know, improper management or
improper management? But I think you've also been seeing that money has not been released to the county government. So without that money, they're not going to be able to pay. The fact is also that the county governments also need to take fiscal policy more seriously at that level. It's true that we've just had counties for 5 years. They've gotten responsibilities that they didn't have before, but it means that people need to step up so that they're able to address those. But just to speak about the impact this is having, I wanted to share a little bit of numbers. We do a manufacturing barometer every quarter. So we did one at the end of quarter 3. And some of the things that genuinely indicate that there's a problem in the economy, we had about 64% of manufacturers who are forecasting zero or negative growth in the next 6 months. About 56% of them actually predicted a decline in new orders. Then in regards to jobs, which shows that people will not have the money that they need to spend, only 22% of manufacturers are planning to employ new employees, and 47% will be reducing current staff. So that definitely speaks to the fact that it's going to have an impact on Mwananchi. So we need to get to the root cause of the issues that are being raised and see how we can move forward as a country to address the issues, because there are genuine issues being raised that need to be addressed, because governance is key. And we live in a political economy. So all these issues must work in tandem.
Interesting. Some rather sobering statistics, I think, as regards jobs and with the manufacturers, What did you say, 22%
22% of them
they will not
plan to only 22 are going to hire, and 47% will be reducing their current staff. Yes.
So those are some interesting numbers to focus on. We want to take a break. Our conversation continues. And when we come back, that little statement about liquidity management. that came out with the cabinet secretary when he talked about floating a Eurobond, that some of that money would be used for liquidity management. And Zetsawere is worried, and so is everybody else here. We'll hear his response to that and then come back and speak more about that with my panel as we continue to discuss the state of our economy and its impact on you, and of course later solutions as well. We'll be right back.